Hi, I'm David Henry Hwang, and this is my life in the theater. So I didn't grow up going to the theater. If anything, I was raised in a family where we were musicians. My mom was a pianist. My sister is a cellist. I played violin. So my early exposure to theater was probably playing in the pit orchestras of high school musicals. And I remember playing Fiddler on the Roof and Oklahoma and Kismet. And I liked to stay around after the orchestra was dismissed and listen to the director give notes. So by the time I got to college, they had us filled in forms like, well, what do you want to do here that you've never done before? And I put journalism and playwriting. I went to Stanford, and Stanford at the time didn't have any playwriting classes. So I just started writing plays in my spare time. And I found a professor who was a novelist and poet who ran the creative writing department and also taught a class in contemporary drama named John Leroux. And I asked John if he would read one of my plays, and he agreed. And he told me that, it was really bad, which it was, and that my problem was that I wanted to write plays, but I didn't actually know anything about the theater. But then John became a mentor. He helped me to design a playwriting major within the creative writing department. And the summer before my senior year, I was home in LA and I saw an ad in the paper that said study playwriting with Sam Shepard. And it was the first year of what became a pretty prominent event in Southern California theater, which was called the Padua Hills Playwrights Festival. But this was only the first year that they tried to do it, so there were only 2 of us that applied to be students, so we both got in. I got to work with Sam and with Maria Irene Fernez, who I think arguably was the great playwriting teacher of her generation. They taught me to write more from my subconscious, not to structure things very much, not to let the conscious mind and sort of craft even dominate, but really follow your heart, follow your impulses, even if you don't know where they're going. And it was through that I began writing Asian American characters. And before then, I just knew I wanted to be a playwright, but I didn't know that I had interest in these issues that started appearing on the page, like immigration and clash of cultures and assimilation and racism. So clearly some part of me was incredibly interested in these issues, but my conscious mind hadn't figured that out yet. So I think I discovered myself both as a playwright and as an Asian American through the same mechanism of creating plays. The Dance in the Railroad and Family Devotions. These were 2 plays that I had running at the Public Theater in 1981 when I was 24 years old, and Joe Papp, the founder of the Public, was still running the institution then. But Dance in the Railroad was actually commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education. So it's hard to imagine nowadays that the government would commission plays. But they wanted 4 plays for young people that they would bring in high school kids to watch these plays from different communities. So I wanted to write a historical play about the Chinese railroad workers' strike on the American Transcontinental Railroad in 1867. And we did it with John Lone, who I'd worked with on my first play at the Public, and Tai Ma, who is probably now known as, everybody's Asian dad on so many TV shows and movies. And we basically created a play which was about this strike, but also incorporated Chinese opera movement, because John was raised in the Cantonese opera in Hong Kong, and Tai was also a Chinese dancer. So we did it during the day for school audiences, and we had one evening performance at which the New York Times critic at that time, Frank attended the show, and he gave it a really rave review in the Times, and so Joe moved it to the public. And it ran for 6 months there. And Family Devotions was a kind of family comedy that I'd written that he had also committed to produce. So they both ended up running at the Public Theater at the same time. M. Butterfly. So M. Butterfly is my first Broadway show. Was at a cocktail party. I heard the story about this French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress in China and in Paris. And the actress turned out to be A, a spy, and B, a man. And when the affair was exposed, the diplomat claimed that he never knew that his lover was a man. So this became, obviously, the type of story you would hear at a cocktail party, and a big scandal in France. But this was like 1986 when I first started working on it. So, of course, there wasn't an internet. It was hard to get kind of international papers. So there was like one column on page 26 of the Times. And I was working with a Broadway producer named Stuart Ostrow, who had previously produced Pippin, 1776, and a number of other shows. And we were trying to do a musical, which never happened. But I told him this idea, and I originally said, okay, we can do this as a musical. But then at the time I didn't know any composers, and I didn't know any lyrics. It just seemed too much, it was like too much trouble. So I just wrote it as a play, and there wasn't much that I could find out about the actual case, so I just made a lot of stuff up. And sent it to Stuart as a courtesy, thinking, he only produces musicals, but he decided to take it to Broadway. We did it out of town in Washington, D.C., and got a bad review in the Washington Post. So the production was hemorrhaging money, and Stuart's partner, David Geffen, decided to close the show, to abort the show. And so Stuart abrogated his agreement with Geffen and mortgaged his house to raise the money to get us to the Eugene O'Neill Theater. And that's how this show got to Broadway. And it's one of those, theater stories, except this one happens to have had a happy ending because we won the Tony for Best Play, and then we ran a couple years on Broadway, and the show has now been produced, I don't know, in like 3 or 4 dozen countries. And there's been a movie and an opera version and a Broadway revival about 5 years ago. So Face Value follows this. And so I had this big hit on Broadway, and I wanted to write a play. I got involved with the protesting the casting of Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian pimp in the original production of Miss Saigon. And we were advocating that this was an example of Yellowface casting and that the role should go to an Asian actor. And it became sort of a pretty big early culture wars fracas. Ultimately, our side, as it were, lost, and Jonathan Pryce did, of course, come to Broadway with the Miss Saigon, and Saigon became a big hit, and Pryce won a Tony. But the whole experience of going up against the kind of establishment and speaking out on a race-charged topic, everybody was against us pretty much, except for Joseph Papp. And so it was kind of traumatizing, and I wanted to write a play about it. And I decided to do a sort of comedy of mistaken racial identity in a farce form. There are a lot of comedies of mistaken gender identity, sort of a classic trope where, the mistress is hidden in the closet or whatever. But I didn't think there had been a comedy about mistaken racial identity. And so I wrote it as a farce and did the first draft and thought, okay, farces are really hard and this is gonna need a lot of work. But I had just had this huge hit. So everybody's like, no, we can just take it right to Broadway. And I guess my hubris was in thinking that I could fix it in 3 months. And so we opened out of town in Boston. We got terrible reviews. It came to New York at what was then the Court Theater. And it was, as opposed to M. Butterfly, where, okay, we got bad reviews out of town, but then when we came to New York, the audiences seemed to be loving it. This one, we got bad reviews out of town, and one of them I remember, the headline was M. Turkey, which, is kind of funny now. But, so we got to New York, and when the audiences still were not really going for it, and so Stewart and his co-producer, Scott Rudin, decided to close the show in previews. And it's, I think, the only show in that decade that we're talking about, the 90s, I think it might have been the only show in the 90s that closed in previews on Broadway. So obviously it was a big flop. So Golden Child was my next Broadway show after the sort of debacle of Face Value. It's based on a novella, kind of, or historical, sort of a family epic, 60-page memoir that I wrote when I was 10 years old about 3 generations of my family's history. So I was 10, my maternal grandmother fell ill, she was the family historian, and I was just one of these kids who always was interested in family history. And I thought, well, if my grandmother dies, it'd be a double tragedy. Of course, we would lose her, but also we would lose all these stories. So I asked my parents if I could I was born and raised in LA. I asked my parents if I could spend the summer with my grandparents who were living in the Philippines, and they agreed. And I went over and did essentially what we would now call oral histories, got them all on cassette tapes, and then brought them home and compiled them into this 60-page, novel, which got Xeroxed and distributed to my relatives, got very good reviews, and then I didn't think about any major writing project for many more years until I got to college. And so Golden Child was a play based on that memoir. And in retrospect, at this point, by the time we got to Broadway, it was 98. So I was 40, I was in my early 40s, I guess. I started thinking about the way in which, okay, as a 10-year-old Chinese American kid, growing up at a time when there were really no images of people who looked like me that weren't either sort of villains or the butt of jokes, I maybe was trying to contextualize myself. I maybe was trying to find a different narrative for my identity. And so I wanted to relook at those family stories. And we opened this show at the Public when George Wolfe was the artistic director. And Benjamin Mordecai, who had been August Wilson's producer, Ben came on as our producer, and we went on kind of an August Wilson-like development tour, where we went to several regional theaters. We also went to the Singapore Repertory Theater. So this was the first time a production from Singapore went to Broadway. And it did okay on Broadway. I mean, we didn't actually run that long, but it was nominated for a Tony for Best Play, and Juliana Solistio was nominated in the supporting actor category, and I think we were also nominated for costumes. So a couple years later, a couple years after Golden Child, Aida comes to Broadway. And Aida is, of course, the Disney musical with songs by Elton John and Tim Rice, which had a complicated development history. It is the only Disney musical, I believe, still to this day, to come to Broadway, which was not based on an animated movie. And it started out as Elton and Tim and a whole different creative team. They opened it in Atlanta, and then Disney decided to kind of reboot the whole thing. So they brought on Robert Falls as the director, and they brought me on to rewrite the book. We created a new Aida, which we opened in Chicago, also to pretty bad reviews, and then continued to work on it between Chicago and opening at the Palace Theater. And the New York Times didn't like it still, but we ran for 5 years, and it's become widely produced, I think, around the country and around the world. And more recently, I started to rework it again with the director Shelley Williams for a new version, which we started in the Netherlands last year. Flower Drum Song. So around the time that I was working on Golden Child, Broadway began to see more and more of these so-called revisicals, where you keep the songs from a musical, an older musical, but you rewrite the book. And Flower Drum Song was, so I was saying earlier that when I was a kid, I never saw any images of people who looked like me in media that weren't villains or the butt of jokes, but Flower Drum Song was sort of an exception to that. And there were things about it that were really innovative for its day. The original was opened on Broadway in, I think it was '58. It's a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical set in San Francisco Chinatown. And as opposed to, Miss Saigon coming in and casting a white guy in an Asian role, Rodgers and Hammerstein in the late '50s really wanted an all-Asian cast. And they mostly succeeded. There were a few non-Asians in the original cast of Flower Drum Song, but mostly it was an Asian cast. And the show was a hit in its day. Oscar Hammerstein called it their lucky hit. It was, it was sort of a tricky moment. Hammerstein was sick. He got diagnosed with cancer, so the book is co-written, but it became a hit. And then by the time you get to sort of the late '90s, it had sort of fallen off the face of the earth. Like nobody was doing it anymore, partly because there were things in the original that were pretty cringy and borderline racist from a late '90s perspective. Second, it just wasn't their best book because of the circumstances under which it was created. And so I approached the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate and asked if I could rewrite the book of Flower Drum Song. And they were really receptive to the idea. And I worked a lot with Ted Chapin, who was the head of R&H at the time, with Mary Rodgers, with Jamie Hammerstein. And we worked on it for 2 or 3 years before getting to a version which was directed by Bobby Longbottom and opened in Los Angeles at the Mark Taper Forum, starring Lea Salonga and Jose Lana. And it was sort of a massive hit in LA. So much so that the theater, it's a regional theater, so they had slots. So the theater decided to extend us into the next slot. And Ben Mordecai brought it to Broadway, to what was then the Virginia Theater. And it did okay. We ran, I think, about 6 months, but it was really a gratifying experience for me. And one of the things that was wonderful about it was the bringing together of several generations of Asian Americans, AAPI performers and artists who had worked on Flower Drum Song. So from the original cast, we had one member of the original tour who was in our production, and members of the original cast, came out to support our production. And then my generation, and then, the young people, it was like Telly Leung's first Broadway show, who were in that production. And to bring that kind of history of Asian American theater and performers on Broadway and off together was really exciting. Oh, I should also add with Flower Drum Song that I did get my third Tony nomination for Best Book of a Musical. So Tarzan was my next Disney musical, and that, of course, is based on an animated movie with songs by Phil Collins. And we did it without an out-of-town tryout. Phil and I worked on the script, we did some workshops, and opened it straight on Broadway at the Richard Rodgers. Didn't get good reviews. We didn't have an out-of-town tryout. We wanted to create a kind of environmental production, which would have a lot of sort of flying and circus elements. So we rehearsed in a soundstage, Steiner Studios in Brooklyn, and then opened at the Richard Rodgers Theater. And again, we didn't get good reviews. And in this case, we did not run as long as Aida. We ran about a year, which is, not wonderful for a Disney musical. However, the show has subsequently become this huge hit in Europe. And it, for instance, ran in Germany for 10 years, and then just reopened in Germany late last year, and they've already announced a second year. They're extending into a second year. So sometimes you find your audiences where you find your audiences. Chinglish. So Chinglish is a play of mine that was on Broadway in 2012. I was traveling back and forth to China a fair amount at that time. China was still pretty fun back then. China at that time also had the goal to gain soft power, that is cultural and artistic influence, through, among other things, creating a show that would end up on our Broadway. I was at the time the only even nominally Chinese person who had written a Broadway show, so I was, going over for meetings, and nothing really ever came of it. But at that time, there was a lot of what's called Chinglish, that is sort of mistranslated English signs in China. And that's pretty funny. But B, it also struck me as kind of an interesting metaphor for communication and the communication breakdown between East and West, and particularly between the US and China. So I decided I wanted to write a bilingual play, which was somewhat challenging because I'm not actually bilingual. I took some Mandarin in college, but basically I can't speak it. So I collaborated with a Hong Kong-based playwright named Candice Chong, who's a friend of mine, and she kind of did the translations. I knew enough about Mandarin so that I could figure out, oh, it'd be interesting to do something about, the tones in, like, someone's trying to say something in Chinese, and they an American is trying to say something in Chinese, and they get the pronunciation right, but they get the tone wrong. I actually didn't even know when I was doing the first draft that I thought it would be kind of amusing, but it ended up being incredibly funny and farcical. And we used the technique, which is pretty common now, but was new then, to project the translations for the Chinese onto the stage. so to use supertitles, because I'd done a lot of work in opera, and opera, of course, has used supertitles for a long time. So I figured, well, we could do that in a Broadway musical, a Broadway show. And Lee Silverman, who had become my major collaborator, Lee was very game to put this all together. We opened at the Goodman Theater in Chicago. Again, we were a huge hit in Chicago. I think we were the most successful play or musical that the Goodman had ever had at that point. And then we came to Broadway and didn't do as well. I feel like I've had, honestly, I've had the experience of having one New York Times head critic who was really in my corner, who was Frank Rich, and then one New York Times critic who was Ben Brantley, who just never gave me a good review throughout his career. And I've come to realize, of course, it's more pleasant. The first is more pleasant, but you know, it's equally unfair. Like, there's just one unfairness that redounds to my advantage, and one that doesn't. And Ben was the critic for a long time, but now there's he's finished. So we'll see what happens. Soft Power is my most recent show, written with Janine Tesori, that we opened at the Public Theater pretty much before the pandemic, like late 2019. This started because I was interested in, still interested in this sort of China's attempt to gain soft power. And in particular, the question of, okay, China has not actually succeeded. Like, now they're not so interested anymore. But there was about 10, 15 years when they really wanted to create cultural and artistic products for the international market. And they never really succeeded. Like, there wasn't a hit Chinese movie. There were hit movies in Chinese from places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, nor was there a major Chinese pop star that broke out on the international scene the way that we see now with K-pop and the various Korean movies as well. So what is that? Is it that authoritarianism and censorship in China and the kind of top-down way in which culture is made, does that ultimately prevent the artists there from creating something that can appeal to the world? And as an American, my knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, that's the problem, but I'm not really sure. So I wanted to write something about that. And then I also had seen Bart Sher's revival of The King and I at Lincoln Center. And The King and I is a show that I'd always loved. And when I saw it in whatever that would have been, 2016, 2017 maybe, I thought, wow, there's some stuff here that's really uncomfortable. Like the fact that it's basically the story of a white woman who goes to Siam to teach the king how to be civilized and join the family of nations. Then the more I sort of read about the actual story of Anna Leon-Owens, the more I realized that, she sort of knew the king, and but she certainly did not have as big an influence on the king as the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical would have us believe. So it became interesting to me how a real-life story can be filtered through a musical in order to inculcate that content into our hearts, which is soft power. And I asked Janine if she was willing to work on it with me, and she agreed, which was a great relief because I felt like, okay, I need someone who really knows about musicals, who has sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of musicals. And Janine, as we were working on this, used the term the delivery system, that musicals are perhaps one of the most effective systems that has been devised, because you watch and listen to this musical, it washes over you, you're having such a wonderful time, and these ideas get inculcated in your heart. Two things happened in the creation of soft power. My original idea was that, okay, it was going to be a reverse King and I, and you'd have a Chinese person who comes to the West and essentially teaches President Hillary Clinton to how to solve the problem of gun violence. And it would start as a play, and then we would see how that play becomes glorified in a musical that is supposedly made in China. So it's kind of a complicated setup. So two things happened. Number one, the 2016 election happened. We were doing a reading of an early version of the show the day of the election. That show still had President Hillary Clinton as a character. And the next day, I called Janine and Lee Silverman, and I said, okay, I think this is really, quite bad for the country, but it could actually be good for our musical. So it became a different story about a Hillary Clinton who loses the election and what that means for democracy. And then the other thing that happened was that I got stabbed in the neck. So I was on my block about 9 p.m. One night carrying some groceries, and I was just stabbed by an unknown assailant who ran away, and ended up losing about a third of my blood and severed my vertebral artery. And so when I was writing the first, one of the drafts of this show, I was writing the play part, and I was about to go into the musical, and I just started writing about my stabbing. And I thought, okay, this is never gonna make it into the show, but I guess I just need to do this. And then it turned out that my stabbing did become a very central part of this show. It becomes the device through which my character, who gets stabbed, he's in a coma, and kind of dreams, in a fever dream, dreams the musical. And we are now we opened at the public. We did pretty well. It was the finalist for the Pulitzer in 2020. We were nominated for a Grammy for the cast album. But we know the show continues to need more work. I can't exactly say what right now, but we will be premiering a new version of it relatively soon. Oh, Yellowface. So Yellowface is a play that will be opening on Broadway, that will make its Broadway premiere this fall at the Roundabout's Todd Hames Theater, starring Daniel Day Kim. The original production opened at the public with Oscar Eustis as the artistic director. It is essentially a rewrite or reconceptualization of Face Value. You may recall that I had said that in Face Value, I wanted to write a comedy of mistaken racial identity, and utterly failed to do so. But failure is, kind of useful and necessary. And I kept thinking, this comedy of a mistaken racial identity is a really good idea. And about 12 years later, I wrote Yellowface, which is a stage mockumentary. So we know what a mockumentary is, whether it's The Office or Curb Your Enthusiasm or Spinal Tap. And we know what a stage documentary is, whether it's some of the work of Anna Devere Smith or the Laramie Project and Tectonic. So this is a stage mockumentary, and it tells the story of a playwright named D.H.H. who wrote a play called M. Butterfly, who protests the casting of Jonathan Pryce as the Eurasian pimp in Miss Saigon, and then mistakenly casts a white actor as the Asian lead in his own play, his own follow-up to M. Butterfly, called Face Value. And when D.H.H. finds out that he has cast a white guy, he thought he was mixed race, and he turns out to be actually just white. And when DHH finds out that he's cast a white guy, he tries to cover up this fact to protect his reputation as an Asian American role model. And that becomes the basis of the farce. So it still is a comedy like Face Value. It still is about mistaken racial identity, but the form is quite different in that it takes on, as opposed to a Feydeau farce or a Joe Orton farce, it's a stage mockumentary. And we will be opening that for the first time on Broadway this fall. Looking back at this point, I find it interesting that, as I've said, I was a kid who grew up with without any images of people, or virtually no images of people who look like me, who seem to be actual human beings. And people sometimes ask me, oh, were you the victim of racism as a kid? And I don't remember specific racist incidents. I'm sure there were a lot of microaggressions. But in retrospect, I feel like I was oppressed by American popular culture, because if I knew that there was going to be a movie or a TV show with an Asian character, I would go out of my way not to watch it generally, because I always knew something terrible was going to happen and something was going to make me feel bad. And so I guess I've spent my adult life trying to gain access to the levers of American art and popular culture and turn that story around and portray characters and narratives through my own lens.